Hi YouTube, my name is Jack. Today I want to talk about the concept of orthopraxy as it is and isn't applied to Wicca. Um, Often on various seekers groups or online forums where people are coming to learn more information about traditional Wicca, one of the questions that is most frequently asked is something along the lines of, what do Wiccans believe? And that's a completely understandable question to ask. Most of us have grown up in a cultural milieu where part of what we understand as the definition of a religion is that a religion comes with a set of prescribed beliefs. These are the things that the religion teaches or expects you to believe, and those beliefs have some kind of explanatory value to help you understand the world around you and your world within it, as well as some kind of action guiding value that helps you live your life in the best possible way. And so a lot of the time when people are first starting to show an interest in paganism, in Wicca, in witchcraft, it feels very natural to ask, well, what are the beliefs that are associated with this particular religious, spiritual, or magical path? And usually when someone asks that sort of question, someone will chime in and say, well, Wicca is an orthopraxy and not an orthodoxy. And what those words mean, roughly speaking, orthodoxy is right belief. There's a certain set of beliefs that you are expected to hold to, and orthopraxy means right practice. So there are a certain set of practices that you're expected to hold to. And when people say this, when people say that Wicca is an orthopraxy and not an orthodoxy, they really generally mean well. What they're trying to convey is that there is no required set of beliefs in Wicca, and that Wicca is defined more by practice than by what you believe. If you show up to the ritual, if you do the ritual, and if you get something out of it, you get to call yourself Wiccan if you want to. And the specific thing that you get out of it is your business, and not necessarily anyone else's. You and I can come to the same ritual and do the exact same thing, and have very different personal experiences, as well as different personal beliefs and interpretations of what we're doing in that ritual. And that's all okay. There's nothing that you have to think or believe in order to call yourself Wiccan. And so people like to say this whole orthopraxy, not orthodoxy thing because it gets at that idea that there is no required belief in Wicca. And that's a very important core concept. But I feel like the word orthopraxy and the way it's presented in contrast to orthodoxy is misleading when we talk about Wicca. For two reasons, really. The first is that while it is true that there's no required belief in Wicca, there are commonly held beliefs. There are commonalities. There are similarities that you will find in a large portion of the Wiccan community. And those aren't requirements by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it is helpful to give people who are coming into the community a sort of indication of what kind of beliefs they might be likely to encounter in this community. Wiccan liturgy is structured in such a way that while you don't have to believe anything particular to be Wiccan, there are certain beliefs that are more common, partly because of just sort of shared interests and overlap in the Wiccan community. You know, people who happen to have certain shared beliefs have come together and fostered a community, but also partly because the Wiccan rituals themselves, and specifically here, once again, I'm talking about traditional initiatory Wiccan rituals, Gardnerian Wiccan rituals, just because I belong to the Gardnerian tradition of Wicca, so that's what I know, that's what I'm talking about. But Wiccan rituals themselves are structured in such a way that you're more likely to get something out of them if you have certain beliefs. That's not to say you can't get something out of them if you don't have those beliefs, but the rituals are designed to facilitate a religious experience for people with a certain point of view. And in particular, I'm thinking about three basic beliefs. The belief in at least two deities, a goddess and a god, the belief in magic, and the belief in reincarnation. None of those three things are required. You don't have to believe in all or any of them in order to participate meaningfully in Wiccan religious communities. I know Wiccans who are atheists. I know Wiccans who are hard polytheists, soft polytheists, etc. I know Wiccans who don't believe in reincarnation or in any kind of survival after death. And I know Wiccans who don't really put much stock in magic as a supernatural means of affecting the world, but will rather talk about altering your own state of consciousness or changing your behavior, interacting with your subconscious mind, various sort of more naturalistic approaches to the idea of spellcraft. So none of those beliefs are in any way required in Wicca, but Wiccan ritual is designed with those beliefs in mind. Sort of implicit in a lot of Wiccan ritual is the assumption that we're taking these sorts of things for granted. So Wiccan ritual is going to structure itself around the invocation of two deities. It's going to structure itself around themes of reincarnation, death and rebirth, and so on. It's going to structure itself around the use of magic and spellcasting. And if you don't have those beliefs, that's totally legit, but you're going to have to do a little bit of extra legwork, just in terms of figuring out for yourself what the rituals mean to you, why they're meaningful, why you get something out of them. As long as you're getting something out of them, that's all that really matters. No one's gonna like peek inside your mind and be like, oh, well, you don't really believe in such and such things, so you don't get to call yourself a real Wiccan. That's not how it works. What you get out of Wicca is your business. Wicca is an experiential religion, and whatever experience you have, if you consider it worth it and you keep coming back, that's great. But generally speaking, if you don't believe in these sorts of things, you might not be as likely to get something out of Wicca. Or alternatively, you might get something out of Wicca, but it might be a very different thing than what a lot of the other people in your coven are getting out of it. That's totally okay, but I think it's worth being aware of that coming into a Wiccan milieu. My own personal beliefs have shifted quite drastically since I first started in Wicca. I came into Wicca with a pretty strong atheistic perspective, and over time, my experiences have sort of shifted my perspective on that, and I now consider myself a theist. But coming into that space at the beginning, I had to figure out, why am I participating in rituals that mention and invoke gods if that's not a thing I believe in? And the answer was, just for me. It was just for me to figure out what I was getting out of that. But it was a question that I had to ask myself. And I think when we say that Wicca is an orthopraxy, not an orthodoxy, sometimes we give the misleading impression that there are no commonly held beliefs in Wicca whatsoever, that there is no sort of shared cultural context of things that people broadly believe. And once again, there's a ton of variation here, right? There's no standard, there's no expectation that you have to believe a certain thing, there's no requirement. But when we say there's no orthodoxy, there's only orthopraxy, that makes it sound like there aren't any shared beliefs whatsoever. And that's not really true. On the flip side, when we say that Wicca is an orthopraxy, that makes it sound like everything that traditional Wiccans are doing, everything that Gardnerian Wiccans are doing, because that's the tradition I belong to, but also if you want to think about Alexandrian Wicca or other strains of initiatory Wicca, when you say it's an orthopraxy, it makes it sound like everything that everyone in one tradition is doing is exactly the same, that there's no variation in practice whatsoever. And that's also not true. There is a lot of overlap, there is a lot of similarity, and I could walk into just about any Gardnerian ritual in the world and still recognize a lot of what was going on. But the specific details of practice vary immensely from one coven to the next. Even in sort of our broad, everyday ritual structure, the thing that is done on, ordinary occasions. Not that ritual is ever an ordinary occasion, but if you're just having your regular meeting and you're not doing a holiday or an initiation or some kind of special ritual, if you're just doing your bread and butter, there are maybe 4 things, big picture, 4 ritual actions that you can expect to see at most, if not all, Wiccan rituals. Uh, Gardnerian Wiccan rituals, I should specify. Sorry, I'm in this bad habit of saying Wiccan when I'm referring to my tradition of Wicca, and once again, that's just because that's the perspective I have. It's because that's the Wicca that I know. I'm not trying to say that this is true of all Wicca. I'm just talking about the Wicca that I know. But so, there are maybe 4 ritual actions that you can expect to see at just about every Gardnerian ritual. But the details of those ritual actions are going to vary quite drastically from one coven to the next. There are going to be ritual flourishes, and people have additions that they like to use, or they've mixed up the words for things, or they do things in a different order, or all kinds of different permutations, variations on a theme. And there's a sense in which it all feels familiar, it all feels sort of the same, but there's also a sense in which there's quite a lot of difference in practice from one coven to the next. And moreover, there are going to be plenty of things that I don't do that you do, or that you don't do that I do, and or that we both do, but we do in very different ways. So that you can't really point to any one thing and say, like, yes, this is the orthopraxy. This is the thing that everyone in the tradition does exactly the same. Because there's always going to be someone somewhere who's done things differently. There is a lot of similarity. I think there's, in some sense, probably more similarity than there is difference, even in covens with very, very different ritual practices. There's still a feeling of, like, you're kind of doing the same thing. But some of that is just vibes. Some of that is just how it feels. Some of that is also kind of a sense of continuity that comes from belonging to a lineage tradition, right? If I ask someone, like, oh, why do you do this particular thing in ritual? I've never seen that before. The answer will usually be something along the lines of, oh, well, we were initiated by Stephanie and John, and they were initiated by Christine and Rupert added this, they wrote this ritual edition that Stephanie and John really liked, and they kept it in, and it's just sort of made its way into our practice. And so you can trace the origin of these various ritual flourishes, and that helps build a sense of continuity across the tradition, even between covens with very different practices. But in some ways, identifying the key elements of Gardnerian ritual is kind of like the diagnostic process that's used like in the DSM for diagnosing mental illness, where you have a list of symptoms. You have like 12 symptoms. And it's like, well, you're not going to see all of these. You're not going to see, like, the ones you do see are going to look different from one person to the next. So this isn't an exact definition. This isn't an all and only sort of thing. But like, if you've got 7 out of the 12, then we can probably diagnose you with Gardnerian Wicca, right? It's something like that, where there are a lot of similarities, and there's no one fixed thing that's going to be exactly the same from one coven's ritual to the next. But you're sort of looking for a constellation of similar practices and overlap. There's also obviously overlap with initiation rituals, but even with initiations, you're going to find that different covens have particular flourishes that they like to do, or they'll do small details of things in different ways, and they may have coven-specific traditions that they build in on top of the tradition-wide initiations, things like that. So you're still, even with something like initiation, which is fairly standard in the Gardnerian tradition, you're still going to find a surprising amount of variation in practice across the tradition from one coven to the next. So because of all of that, I feel like the word orthopraxy is misleading, because orthopraxy really makes it sound like we're all doing exactly the same thing. And the answer is a lot muddier than that. We're not all doing totally different things. We're doing like the same thing, but you aren't going to have exactly the same practice from one coven to the next, or even within a coven from one ritual to the next. Some covens are going to experiment with things and try out new things. And so, I can walk into any Gardnerian ritual in the world and more or less recognize what's going on, but I can't walk into any Gardnerian ritual in the world and know exactly what's going to happen next, because there's variation. So, I think the orthopraxy versus orthodoxy thing is coming from a good place and is really trying to get at the idea that Wicca is about what you do and not about what you believe. And that's valuable. That's really, really important. But when we present it in that way, It has this sort of unintended effect of A, suggesting that there are no shared beliefs in Wicca, which is not really the case, and B, suggesting that there is no variation in practice in Wicca, which is also not really the case. So, just wanted to sort of talk through that, get some thoughts off my mind. I hope you're all doing well. Have a wonderful week, and I will talk to you sometime soon. Bye.